Welcome back to the Scar Wealth Podcast. This week, we open with a listener who's managed every dollar of her family's $19 million balance sheet for 30 years, while her husband has never opened a statement. A recent health scare has forced the question of what happens when the spouse who runs everything is out of the picture. Then we hear from a couple whose beach house income just disappeared overnight. A county zoning change killed short-term rentals in their street, and the $10,000 a week they were counting on for retirement is gone. They're weighing whether to sell, convert to a long-term rental, or rethink the property's role entirely. And in From the Field, we're joined by Jessica McGawley, founder of Dollington, who spent the last decade preparing the next generation of family wealth and family business heirs for everything traditional estate planning typically leaves out. So let's go ahead and start with question number one. I had a small health scare last month and realized my husband doesn't know where any of our money is. 30 years of marriage, about $19 million across retirement, brokerage, and a vacation property. And my husband has never paid a bill, reviewed a statement, or met with our advisor. I'm not trying to be morbid, but I know this is a problem. How do other families handle the transition when the spouse who manages everything is suddenly gone? So this is a huge question that comes up. It was actually one of the questions that surprised me most whenever I first started advising. I was fully expecting to have questions where everyone was coming into the meeting excited to be talking about their finances. And instead, what I found out is there was a certain subset of people who were coming to me for advice that knew everything of what they're doing with their finance. They're very comfortable with their finance. They had no need for an advisor. And they would sit in the meeting and they'd say, Stephan, I agree with everything you're saying. I'm already doing a lot of those things. I'm really here because my wife's never looked at our finances. So I just want to make sure there's somebody that she can call if something ever happens to me. And that still to this day is a segment of people that we have, that we work with, that are not looking at us as advisors, but looking at us as that hedge against something happening to them. So what that's led to is us to have this conversation fairly often of how do you go from having one spouse who's managing everything, what I've always classified as the family CFO. And that's not uncommon, where we see separation of responsibilities and one spouse is handling everything. They're handling the bill payments, they're handling the investments, they're talking to the advisor, they're handling all the details that are going on. And the other spouse doing some other things in the family. The problem with that is operationally, there's a major knowledge gap that shows up. And it's not a gap of we have the money, so we're going to be fine. That's one thing, right? If assets are there, sounds like you have that under control because you've been a good family CFO. The question is, how do you actually do the stuff if you're gone? And what is he going to do? So what I recommend is you need what I've always called the when I die document. You need a when I die document that's going to break down something happens to me. These are the people you call, what the logins are, what bank accounts you have accounts with, what's in there, all the basics. What would you want him to know? And it doesn't have to be long. I recommend mixing in some sort of family balance sheet with that. So one page, where are the assets? Where are the liabilities? What are the account numbers? Right? Passwords and usernames, I'm a little skeptical on. I'm not a fan of you putting username and passwords all in one document that says, hey, hack my account and get access to every account I own. And that's not what we want to do. Account numbers you can put in there, but use a password manager that are out there, and they're popping up all over the place. You have Apple, Keychain, LastPass, all these different technology companies that are out there that are set up as password managers to allow you to have complicated passwords. But what they'll have is some succession setting, which will allow you to say that if something happens to me, my spouse can get into these accounts and have access to all those passwords. Because where this becomes a problem is not that he's not going to be able to get into the accounts. It's that this is going to be a very stressful time anyways. Something happens to you, right? He's not going to be in the best state of mind. And now it just adds a ridiculous amount of stress and complexity when you're already going through something so hard. And now he's trying to figure out what the password is to the Wells Fargo account, or whether or not you have your money at Wells Fargo or you keep it at Bank of America. I don't know. It might be that he doesn't even know that comparison. So having that balance sheet set up and knowing where he can find it is a big deal. Now, this might be asking for too much, but I would recommend at least every quarter, 15 minutes. Right? Go out to a nice dinner, do whatever you need to do to present the family balance sheet to him of here's where our money's at and here's how bills are paid. right? It's in this kind of cash flow statement. It's in this account. These are who our main contacts are. If something ever happens to me, you call this person, they're our attorney. You call this person, this is our advisor. You call this person, this is our CPA. And here's where all the passwords are. Here's what you need to know. So that little bit of a letter of what he needs to do and who he needs to contact will go a long way. And I think if you help him understand that this isn't only a benefit for you, so you don't have to worry about this, but a massive benefit for him. If something happens to you and he's stuck in the situation where he's going to have to handle this, your family is going to be very glad that there's a repository somewhere that says, here are where all the accounts are and exactly what's in them. And updating that once a year makes perfect sense. What you got to do is you got to prepare for that process, not just the money that's there. It has to be accessed some way. All righty. And on to our second question. And dang, these have come up more and more over the past few years and starting to become even a concern whenever buying a property. So for our second question here, the county just passed a zoning change that killed VRBO rentals on our street. We're 63 at $10,000 a week of summer income from our beach house was a key piece of how we thought about that property. The house is worth around $4 million. We have another $9 million invested. We don't strictly need the retirement income, but losing it changes the math on what the property is actually for. Should we sell, convert to a long-term rental, or hold it as a family asset and move on? 10,000 a week is no joke on a $4 million investment. No wonder it's a key component of your income. And I'm sure you're able to enjoy the property for the rest of the year as well. And that $10,000 a week was offsetting a lot of those expenses. And that's typically how we hear about vacation homes being used, or at least thought about at the beginning before purchase. It's like, let's go through this. We're going to buy this rental. We're going to pay for $4 million for it. It would be expensive for us to maintain on our own. But you know what? If we rent it out during the summer, we got $160,000 coming in, and that's going to help pay some of the taxes and the insurance and the overall upkeep of the property. And for the other 8 months of the year, we're going to be able to use it and we're going to love it and have the family be able to use it and all those things. So that's the typical story that is told. And you actually seem to be one of the few people who used it like you were supposed to. A lot of people do the short-term rental for a little bit and say, you know what, I don't want people staying in our house. So we're going to cut that off and we're just going to bear the full expense of that property. But now you're in a situation where you need to decide what the use is of this house. And I would completely reframe this entire conversation as taking a step back and having an honest question of, would you buy this house today for $4 million if you were completely starting over? And if the answer to that question is no, there's no way we would do it, then it's time to sell the property. If the answer is, well, maybe if we could afford it, then look at it and start digging into the numbers and see whether or not you can personally afford to pay for the holding costs of this property for as long as you would like to own it. And that's the way I would look at it. This is such a significant shift in the math to this property that I would look at this completely from scratch and say, what is the value of this property now if we were to sell it? And do we want to own this property now personally for us? And you might be able to jump into the long-term rental discussion. My only problem with the long-term rental is that's a whole other conversation. Now you have another question that comes in that says, would we buy this property as a rental property for us as an investment? And my guess is going to be no. Very, very, very rarely does a vacation home work out as a pure long-term rental investment. And the reason for that is because you're competing against people who want to buy the home for pleasure. And whenever somebody's buying the home with discretionary income or discretionary cash for pleasure, they're willing to overpay. So they're not looking at it purely as an investment opportunity, and that's who you're competing against for it. So the odds are you're probably going to be able to sell it for a good amount, but it's not going to work from a pure long-term rental math when you jump into the cap rates and is this competitive? It's probably not going to be competitive. So you're looking at this purely as, can you use this as a personal family property purely for enjoyment? And is that something that fits in your budget? If the answer is yes, we can do this and it works out, then keep the property if you're enjoying it. But if the answer is no, we can't afford it, and I wouldn't buy it right now for $4 million, then time to walk away, put it on the market. There may be some concerns there with capital gains, depending on how the math has been done over the past few years of whether or not you've been taking any depreciation on that. You're going to have to get that lack of step up in basis. So you're going to have to pay the tax on that capital gains. But that's the decision that you're dealing with now, and that's how I would look at it is purely would you buy it today for 4 million? Answer is yes. Then go for it. Enjoy the beach house. And now you get the benefit of you being able to use it during the summer as opposed to renting it out to somebody else. At Scholar Advising, we work alongside your full financial picture as independent thought partners for a flat fee, not as account managers or product sellers. We help you think through the options, stress test the decisions, and build a clear path toward your long term goals. Visit scholaradvising.com. So, next in our From the Field segment, we're joined by Jessica McGawley, founder of Dollington, an advisory firm dedicated to preparing the next generation of family wealth and family business heirs. For more than a decade, Jessica has worked with the rising generation across multi generational families and family enterprises, building curriculum, coaching around things that traditional estate planning typically leaves out, things like identity, governance, communication, and the psychological side of inheriting significant wealth. Jessica, welcome to the Scholar Wealth podcast. To start, why don't you give us a little bit of background of how you got into this this corner of the family wealth space?
Of course, it is pretty niche, so the story probably does help. So I, for 7 years, worked in a succession firm in London, very much working with families as they were preparing their assets to transfer to the next generation, but slightly more on the technical side, trust, wills, estate planning, all the things you'd expect a family to have. But I was working on the next generation piece. So really looking after quite a much younger generation, more 18 to really maximum 30, on what are the other pieces that you need to know to be prepared for this. And the thing I repeatedly saw was that this is not a one off event that needs to happen once a year. Children from these families really need an ongoing curriculum and education that supports them. And so that's where Darlington was born, and that was 10 years ago.
So when you think about those gaps that are there that are not in the official documentation, right? When you're looking at the trust and all the partnership agreements and everything, what are the things that you noticed as gaps that show up that you're trying to fill that maybe go unnoticed when it comes to whether it's parents or attorneys or just the business management team that you tend to see?
The phrase I always like to say is that very successful families that I've worked with, affluent families, wealthy families, are very good at preparing the wealth for the people. They are not so good typically at preparing the people for the wealth. They're two sides of the same very important coin, and one without the other is lost. Both are completely necessary, but we need to prepare the people. So what I kept on seeing were beautifully constructed trusts, a lovely constitution and charter, a beautifully written letter of wishes, a will, investment structures, philanthropy structures. If you turn to the people who are inheriting those structures and you ask them, what is a trust? What is a beneficiary? Do you know that you're a beneficiary? Do you know who your advisors are? Do you know where you have this person versus that person? Do you know what the difference between a single or a multifamily office is? None of them could answer it. So what I kept on seeing was all of these, very technical aspects were being taken care of, but the educational piece, but also the psychological and relational piece that is quite unique to this group was missing. And so that's just to give you an overview.
Yeah. So can you go into that in a little bit more detail when it comes to some of those non-technical skills that come up? Because I can understand the need for what I call kind of the textbook education of this is what a trust looks like. This is a different type of office, right? You have all of these areas beneficiary. But then I imagine there's the other side of the coin, which is has nothing to do with the actual written technical skills or the ability to sit in a board meeting. What are those things that you come up with to and say, these are the ones that you really need to learn? There's a significant range of topics that you're getting into. Some of that curriculum is the technical skills that you're talking about, but then other pieces get out to character and philanthropy. How do you go about training someone with those things that typically aren't known as textbook trainable topics?
Well, I think it's a really good point. And what I would say is a lot of what we teach, frankly, should, in an ideal world, be available to anybody, regardless of their wealth. However, if you are the child of a very wealthy family or a family business, yes, of course, there are privileges that come with that, but there are also very unique challenges and responsibilities that come with that. And therefore, you need to learn certain things. So, like you say, basic beneficiary education, financial education, that stuff needs to happen. What also needs to happen is if I'm inheriting a business with my siblings and cousins who I don't spend too much time with or who are all dispersed across the globe, how are we going to make decisions together? How will we manage if there's a conflict in the generation above us? Will it filter down to us? Are there agreements in place for this? What if none of us want to take up leadership? What if we all want to take up leadership? Things like that really need to be addressed before they become a problem. And so to give you a perfect example, when I'm working with a family enterprise, I will sit down and say to them, a family business only ever has three real options. Option one, it remains family owned and family run. Option two, it remains family owned but professionally run. And option three is it's sold. All those three options have very different outcomes, but they all have different responsibilities. And some of them are very practical, but some of them will massively impact how you see yourself, how you raise your children, the next generation, for example, and how you relate to each other. So to go into that in a little bit more detail, some of the main challenges we see with the rising generation are things like isolation, feeling that these problems are only theirs and that there's so much stigma and shame around talking about them that they daren't. There's issues with motivation. What do you do if you really need to get a job? If you know that actually there's always a safety net there for you or a job if you needed one, that can kill that fire that most of us actually look back on as being a great part of our, teens or early 20s. And another part of it is if you are ambitious, but every room you walk into, someone says, you're so-and-so's daughter or son, and the reason you got this job or the reason you're able to start this business is because of that. That can be so defeating and demoralizing. So, a lot of people, when I talk like this, will either roll their eyes and think these aren't real problems. But we have to remember that this younger generation are highly aware of the privilege that they come into. And most of the families I work with do enormous amounts to offset that and to try and be very engaged in their community and in philanthropy. But these young people are just trying to do their best with the information that they have.
I imagine that identity issue is something that comes up pretty often, especially when your family has created this massive organization enterprise that it would be odd if you didn't run it, right? There's really not another option for you. There are some other options, but the gap between those other options and the path you're kind of slated for is so vast that you run into this identity component of how do you be yourself when you're supposed to follow this very narrow path to run this business that was created generations ago for you.
It's a huge amount of pressure, and there is so little empathy or understanding of that for this group. And if we think about most challenges, there's somewhere you can go for it. There will be other people, but like I said, there is the stigma and shame of, well, I have money, so I really shouldn't be seen to be talking or complaining about this. But that doesn't help anybody, because in some cases, I have families where they employ thousands of people in some cases internationally. And if the son or daughter I'm working with is set to be either working in that business or at least a shareholder and has decision rights over how that business is run, we really want those people to be making well-adjusted decisions from a grounded place.
How do you effectively coach that or teach that? Because that is very much not something that can be on one page of here's a handout today on how to have identity in this type of business. Do you find that case studies, is it just examples, or is it just talking through those scenarios with other people who are in a similar situation? How do you mix in different ways to convey that information to that generation?
So that's a very good point, and I've tried many times to try and get that on one page and failed, and so I hear what you're saying. So first of all, a family or an individual has to be ready to want to actually think about this and learn this. So that's number one. You have to be at least curious about this stuff for it to land. If they are, and then you get the family in the room, because I could be working with an 18-year-old from a multi-generational family, or I could be working with the whole family. But we always say the family is in the room. It's a system. So even if you're working with one person, the whole system is there in effect. So you really ideally want the whole family to be on board that this is something that is worthwhile to consider and think about. Now, the way that you do that, the way that we certainly do that at Darlington over the last 10 years, is that we've designed essentially a course, a program. There are very, straightforward curriculum modules that you go through that we encourage everybody to go through. But then there's the coaching, the psychological, and then the group peer piece that's really important as well. So sitting with other people from similar circumstances where you can talk about and share your experiences and how you handled things. So it'll be hopefully of no surprise to your listeners that whilst we might be talking about, big companies that employ lots of people, the average person who comes into these doors also wants to talk about, you know what, I've just started dating someone. I really like them. I don't know when to tell them who my family are. I wonder how that will change how they see me. Or I'm just about to go off to college. I, I know that there's going to be a diverse number of people from different backgrounds and financial statuses here. How do I manage that? Will they look at me differently? What do I say? So some of this is just really rites of passage.
Related to that rites of passage idea, I imagine the conversations vary quite a bit depending on age. With your curriculum, do you find that the same curriculum works for different age groups, or do you have it broken down to where the kind of pre-college conversation seems very different than the I'm 25 to 30 and now I'm a VP of some division in the business and maybe I'm up there faster than what would traditionally be
Yeah.
expected in the company?
Don't get me wrong, whilst we have those who are a little bit older, on the whole, we are really working with that late adolescence, early adulthood, formative
Okay.
years. When we tend to work with people who are in their 30s or coming up to 40, it's in the sibling cousin, what we call the Rising Gen program. But no, you're absolutely right. The sorts of conversations that a 16 versus 30-year-old are having will vary, but the core messages are often still the same.
So that's interesting because where you started, you said that you were in that kind of 18 to 30-year-old range, but you seem to have picked the younger age there as the area of focus. Was there a reason for that?
Yes, definitely. Well, for one, we started the business 10 years ago. And at that point, I looked a little bit less like their parents. And now I'm starting to morph into the age. What we find is really important is to feel somewhere at least between the age of them themselves and their parents. You're not their natural authority figures. You're also not their best friends. You're somewhere in between. And so I say this, and it sounds like I'm going to see myself out of a career in the process. But what I'm trying to do is also train and build up, far more people to do this sort of work where they can engage that younger generation.
Have you seen a shift in that generation? We hear so much about generational shifts as a whole in your world where you're focused on all these different struggles and there's different concerns that generations have. Have those concerns changed over time, let's say over the past 10, 20 years?
I think it's a really good question. And I find it actually really irritating and quite lazy when you see those things on LinkedIn and Instagram that say, millennials do this and Gen Z do this, etc. Because you can't bunch people quite so easily like that. I think what you can see in terms of, and you'll know more about this than I would, in terms of the way that a younger generation are investing or looking at money has changed. So the younger generation that I work with is certainly having more conversations or dare I say it, even debates with their parents and their advisors about how ethical the investments they're making are, what the boards are like, how diverse they are. They really care about that, which is no bad thing. But what I would say is the biggest shift is also what we must not forget is the parents. So I don't know if you or your listeners have read Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation.
Yes.
Okay. So it's a fantastic book, fantastic research. What I would argue is that this younger generation is not the youngest generation. I would argue that and I'm a millennial, I'm 39, I'm a mother. I would argue that we are the ones who are far more anxious. We're the ones who are constantly throwing in safety nets, checking in on our kids, tracking them, fixing things. And when we look at this with the client group that I look after, is absolutely essential that they learn how to problem solve. And we manage to better tolerate our uncomfortability with that. if some of these young people are set to inherit the vast sums they are, and in some cases the businesses they are, like I said, they have huge responsibilities. They can't do that if they've been mollycoddled and shielded their entire adolescence and then expected to take up these huge, pressurized roles.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about that, especially the problem solving nature of a lot of these decisions, especially with AI and everything now coming into to play. I'm sure that's even more of an important role. When you think about this, as we start to kind of wrap up in this idea of preparing that next generation for this, do you have a story that you go to or a situation that you look back at and say, if I could look at what we do, this is a good example of it went well. And I know there's countless situations that that's happened. But is there one that you constantly go to that you kind of hang your hat on and say that this is exactly why I created this type of curriculum in this school, and this is what happened?
Oh, absolutely. So I have lots of individual cases where, now we're 10 years into the business, I'm seeing them get married, take up these positions, have their first child, and seeing that is just the biggest joy. But what is probably what a more complicated example is when you're working with a family business, because in that instance, you're working with at least two generations, and likely the family office and other advisors. And there's lots of people and moving parts. And if I think about one of our earlier families, where quite traditional in values, quite traditional in also communication. There was a lot of things were being boundaried and kept and not out of control, just that's always the way that things had been done. And the younger generation were really in the dark about what to expect, what pathways were available. I remember them saying, well, if our parents would just tell us what the roles are, then we'll show them if we're interested. And the parents are saying, if they show us they're interested, we'll tell them what the roles are. And no one was having these conversations. So we did what we did do best, and we stuck our oar in and got in there and said, look, we are not having some important conversations. Some of this is going to be pretty tricky, but what we need is your consistency, your time, and your curiosity just to show up to these meetings. And if it feels uncomfortable, that's fine. We just want you to say it, to be honest. I'm not enjoying this. This is tough for me. That's okay. We can work with that. It's when you're avoidant, you don't show up, you don't do the work, we won't get a result here. Bless them. They trusted us, stuck the course, and 3 years in, two of those family members joined the family business in roles that they actually wanted with clear pathways. The other two took different paths but were still shareholders, and they formed a family council. They're still going on their family holidays every year together, and they have much better lines of communication. So for me, the ultimate joy is when the priority being the family is the thing that become strengthened over that. If the money in the business is improved in the process, fabulous. But for me, the family is first.
Absolutely, as it should be. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for coming on today and spending some time with us. I very much appreciate it.
Much appreciated.
That's our show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
The information provided in this podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to constitute financial, investment, or other professional advice. The opinions expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated organizations. Investing in financial markets involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Before making any investment decisions, you should consult with a qualified financial advisor who can assess your individual financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. Thanks for listening.